So I'll be presenting today architectural power, cybernetic governance, and infrastructural control as part of an ongoing exploration of cybernetics and the politics of architectural production. The task of delimiting an argument in relation to cybernetics, its political reality, and the discursive manner in which it has been architecturally engaged is quite devious in and of itself. And so there's several things that I'll try to not be doing, or I'll try to not fall into the black hole of some things. The first being, the point is not to further convince of the ubiquity of cybernetics as a contemporary epistemology. This has already been done by media theorist Klaus Pius, by media and literary theorist Christina Yulee, by philosopher Yu Hui, by historian Orrin Halpern, and by media theorist Alexander Galloway, at least to name a few. The point is also not to claim that there is a architectural history of cybernetics. This has already been done as a set of technical histories, politicized or not, by architectural historians and theorists such as Natalie Berdella, Reinhold Martin, Georg Vrakleotis, and Saad Metzil, and that is just to name a few, but definitely looking into these tools from the 60s and the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and even kind of recently. This has been done as a technical history. And finally, the point is not to be the first one to decry the ongoing subtle influence of cybernetic concepts in architecture, which has been done, at least in small part, by architect Frederick Torreson, in the way that he has looked at the kind of underlying concepts that we've brought into architectural thinking, architectural education, but we no longer call them cybernetic. And this is largely when it comes to any time that we have participation in ecology come up. The point is rather to approach and monitor this condition, cybernetics as a material and ideologically reproductive force, continuing to learn what and how we are, to quote Deleuze, being made to serve, and how the telos of the disciplines in architecture, as in media or technology, contributes to that condition. This involves understanding the current construction of power and how its political affordances might allow us a vision of contemporary lines of flight, forms of escape, or kind of turns in the plane. And that brings up, second point, this new binary drop. With a smirk and a nod to Bergson, cybernetics begins with a performative implosion of the binary, in this case, the binary between vitalism and mechanism. Wiener describes in his 1948 book, Cybernetics, this as a Pyrrhic victory. He says, vitalism has won to the extent that even mechanisms correspond to the time structure of vitalism. But as we have said, this victory is a complete defeat. For from every point of view which has the slightest relation to morality of religion or religion, the new mechanics is fully as mechanistic as the old. Today, technical and cultural discourses drawing from cybernetics continue to tilt at these popular modernist binaries and push and position themselves kind of morally as cultural critique. The 2024 architectural anthology, The Space of Technicity, describes such a focus as understanding formations between ecology, architecture, cybernetics in order to understand the material and life affordances that they provide, and to using the post-human overlay of environmental, social, and technological dimensions to dissolve the binaries. But deconstructing binaries, or at least declaring binaries deconstructed, is largely only an uneven preoccupation of convenience and tends to overlook the underlying binaries which remain. And I would say, namely, hierarchical versus non-hierarchical. According to Maros Krivy, who's a smart city analyst, traditional urban critiques of the mid-20th century, like that from Jane Jacobs, and I mean, usually who I'm speaking to are architecturally are kind of urban trained, and so I might have some things that I throw out, but Jane Jacobs is put in opposition to Robert Moses as somebody that is doing top-down kind of urban planning versus community-first urban planning. But that these concepts of top-down and bottom-up have simplified urban realities into easily digestible binaries, which are no longer viable and otherwise only help to make the argument of smart city automation easier. And so this kind of looking at, well, if we just have these kind of protocological community interactions within the block, this is actually something that is absorbed into smart city planning quite easily. And so as kind of Wiener describes, that Moses loses in the 1950s, but he then wins in the 2010s because these Jane Jacobs operations then become the rubber Moses way. Secondary, this binary of the techno-positive versus technophobic cybernetic examinations in architecture, such as that in the 2021 issue of All Is In Formation, tend to extend enthusiastically into the conceptual power of cybernetic models while blocking critique as such as methods. As technologically, they kind of produce a vision of the world in which anybody that kind of critiques technology or the specific uses of technology as technologically illiterate or technophobic. These calls draw upon a philosophy of technology coming specifically from Hurl and Simondon, while ignoring criticality. Conflating these reflections of cybernetic critique with Luddism, Christian Gerard, an architectural historian, writes, "Technophobia, just like anti-science, fails to understand how it is unreasonable to despise reason, unproductive to put limits on rationalization, absurd to lament an overdose of rational thinking and acting." And he does so as a reaction to the critics of this kind of digitalization within urban processes. However, if we follow Hurl and Simondon, we find that technologies in their very material sense are central to the contemporary condition, socially, constructively. As such, admonitions of the critique of technical objects and processes in the manner that they condition cultural, social, and political realities function only as a critical disengagement, or kind of a taking the ball and going home. Finally, this division between the material and the ideological, which comes up a lot in this technopositive versus technophobic. The utility of this technopositive, technophobic divide also shows another binary, which is self-evidently nonsensical, but ubiquitous in post-critical approaches to cybernetics and architecture and other fields. The binary of the material ideological, which are inherited as mutually exclusive attributes. However, this binary is easily dispersed with any amount of kind of cyberfeminist or software studies research. And then comes, let's say, the new immersive binary. A part of the inherited dichotomies that we're not kind of looking at, the new binary that arises, conditioning knowledge and production, can be, or has been said to be this binary of system environment, or even if that is one way to look at it, this kind of triad of the agent, the system, and the environment. Now, following the cybernetic definitions of Ludwig von Förster and sociological theories from Niklas Luhmann, Christina Yulee notes the two fundamentals of this theory are that the functional distinction between system and environment replace all ontological binarisms inherited by the metaphysical tradition. This is subject to object, body mind, culture, nature, individual, society. And the environment is meant in a specifically cybernetic way, as a black box source of complexity, the space within which the system is always attempting to establish itself as stable. Especially this kind of relates to the environment coming in from managerial studies from Stafford Beer, and that which infected kind of architectural thinking. Now, having this new kind of system environment and agent to talk about, then we can move into how does this come to politics or agency in connection. The intentional organization of this triad can be examined through Deleuze's Society of Control, interestingly enough shorthanded as SC, the same as Smart City in academic urban texts. Deleuze describes the control society as historically new forces which are in the process of replacing the disciplinary societies, which so assuredly separated sites of subjective production in the mode of modern rationality. The static becomes fluid, access becomes modulable. I'm going to assume a little bit of prior knowledge and only take or make some cursory extensions. But Michael Hart extends Deleuze's vision of dividuation and perpetual training as control is thus an intensification and generalization of discipline, when the boundaries of the institutions have been breached, corrupted, so that there is no longer a distinction between inside and outside. The empire's institutional structure is like a software program that carries a virus along with it, so that it is continually modulating and corrupting the institutional forms around it. It's within this ecologized, overlapping system environment dyads that Tikkun claims that a theory of the subject is now only possible as a theory of apparatuses. Control, taken as the ability to manipulate behaviors within this free-reeling world of environment system-agent relations, is the circulation of power which conditions and reproduces the world as an abstract set of relations. In the form of moment steering and analysis, smart city logics present replacing democratic forms of governance with procedural governance, something that is also kind of inherited from the political outview of Wiener and cybernetics, exactly as described in some archival work that was done by Andrew Culp. Now, with these new relational diagrams, these new networks, there is then a new politics. Per Alexander Galloway, this politics is distributive, derivative, balance-oriented, asymmetric-oriented, and protocological. Now, what I'll be getting into is a few ways that architecture has approached the political nature of cybernetics. And this is at least, this is not comprehensive, but it has the main kind of thrusts that we have coming in from architectural reflection. Reinhard Martin approached the organizing fusion of cybernetics and architecture in the wake of Catherine Hale's research in the 90s, and did so via the technical lineage of architectural history established by Siegfried Gideon and through Mechanization Takes Command, a book that came out the exact same year as Cybernetics. As we can see here, Gideon examines the mechanization of society and how that affects modern architecture at the same time. It even kind of comes down to the conclusion of the cart leading the horse in many different ways. Further, kind of contemporaneously, we also have György Kepes is a curator and artist that brings these into at least kind of exhibitional space to begin looking at these new sort of system formations, protocological kind of actions, and different aesthetics of these sort of system science. He's directly inspired by Wiener and the introduction of cybernetics. The year before Kepes's new landscape exhibition, which we just saw, Wiener and two MIT colleagues, Karl Deutsch and Giorgio de Santillana, extend themselves as systems theorists into urban design, developing a concrete cybernetic plan for the city in the event of atomic attack. Infrastructural lanes modeled after communication lines, the post-war urban center was an ever anxious urban center. These design fascinations of the atomic age city and the Kepes exhibitions are posed in the further work of Karl Deutsch, one of the contributors to this atomic city plan. And as a political scientist, Deutsch saw cybernetics as a logic through which to understand contemporary political communication and operative systems, and to reform the efficacy of the liberal democratic project. Per Martin, quote, control, naturalized through the organism, became the linchpin of a basically liberal, if technocratic, program of diagnosing and correcting societal imbalances through an organizational dynamics. And in comparison to Deutsch's computational attempts at approaching humanist values, another MIT cyberneticist, Jay Forrester, would propose the systemic management of the social, political, and urban status quos with a less structural and more neoliberal focus, emphasizing urban profitability and economic balance, and deconstructing state-led support systems of lower-income housing and related social initiatives. And he does so by kind of turning this into something that is extremely logical, that we can look at. This seems like this is producing an apolitical system of managing the city, but a lot of his own biases and conservative biases at the time are kind of baked into these system diagrams, would be the point. A secondary way of approaching this in architecture has been looking at the kind of cultural resonances of where these cybernetic concepts take place. And specifically how they take place between three sites of action. Extending Forrester's own research, his research into urban dynamics, then influenced the Club of Rome in coming up with the limits to growth in 1972. Simultaneously, there's this apolitical kind of technophilic hippie culture through Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth catalog, eventually The Well in the 1980s, that this counterculture to think tank and then to university institutions like the Architecture Machine Group, in which we see here their 1970 exhibition Seek, which is basically the use of these concepts to reconstruct a city. Of course, you can't use people, you have to use mice, and something that comes up in the research in the last 10 years but wasn't published at that time is the amount of kind of dead mice that come out of this exhibition. Now, moving on from there, that it's not just let's say, the Architecture Machine Group, then to be the MIT Media Lab beginning in the 1980s. But it's not just these three. There's also the kind of avant-garde practitioners of architecture on a practical level are introducing and playing with these concepts, this in the form of some, Arata Isazaki is a part of kind of a cybernetic-led movement in Japan, but we also have this in Europe, and also socially, this is introduced into hippie cultures in the United States, and that's where we have locations like Drop City, and various kind of visions of the future as well that are very system-oriented, cybernetically oriented, and have these kind of conceptions of ecology, one's agential place within that ecology, and the kind of, or at least the imaginary of a closed system ecology, which is produced through these avant-garde visions. The final way that architectural theorists and historians have approached cybernetics, at least in a political way, has been through kind of terming it as neoliberalisms. As a tertiary approach, Douglas Spencer has deconstructed neoliberalism within architecture, its spaces, and ideological processes. And he has done so in part due in part by the deconstruction of cybernetic practices in form of increased communication and derivative forms of control within previously disciplinary sites. And so we see here the sites of labor, sites of education. Spencer hones in on two built examples which parallel the disciplinary sites of labor and education, Zaha Hadid's BMW factory extension in Leipzig, and Foreign Office Architects' Ravensbourne College in London. Taking these buildings as spatialized extensions of cybernetic systems, Spencer describes the dominant tendency within architecture was towards the affirmation of the emerging cybernetic environment, with its trans-categorical forms of knowledge, its entrepreneurial orientations, its celebrations of networked mobility, and its promises of self-transcending immersion. Now, Spencer positions these shifts specifically as a response to the protest of 1968 via architectures which embody the cybernetic versions of freedom, choice, and excitement, but are moreover used to produce a generally passive set of users within it. In spaces such as the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris, Spencer writes that architectural space is used to, quote, displace the political just as environments came to displace the social and the object of architecture. Technologically facilitated and cybernetically modeled, design and architecture are reconceptualized and as essentially innovative practices of managerialism. This presents itself as well in the form of new design processes within IDEO-esque design thinking or new self-organized product planning tools like EK's 3D Room Planner. As an ideological apparatus, this approach takes neoliberalism as a truth game in which certain positive cybernetic concepts, engagement, ecology, environment, sustainability, are rewritten into a flexible but omnipresent naturalized order. Now, Each of these ways has been fairly productive, but each of them kind of misses a turn that's happening. And even I would say in this last example that I find Spencer really useful for producing a critical view towards cybernetic ideologies in architecture, but where he kind of lands is kind of like a regression to the an older form of critique. And I think that a part of beginning to understand how this works in architecture as well as elsewhere is also understanding the political shift that has happened, a shift in political paradigm. Per the radical French language theory collective Tikkun, the cybernetic hypothesis is thus a political hypothesis, a new fable that, beginning with the Second World War, has definitively supplanted the liberal hypothesis. Unlike the latter, it would have us think of biological, physical, and social behaviors as being integrally programmed and programmable. Additionally, Tikkun described cybernetics as a paradigm and technique of government, a fusion of prescription and action in the same manner as has been explored, at least in software studies, through people like Wendy H.K. Huhn. However, in order to completely understand the potential manners of the shift, we need to examine a related framing of a previous paradigmatic turn, as explored in the political theorist Chantal Mouffe and the late Ernesto Laclau, and their work on post-Marxist hegemonic strategy and the political dimension of in the era after a so-called democratic revolution. Now, they describe the democratic revolution as the political paradigm which emerges out of the 18th century as a reaction to the formation of new publics, whose legitimizing force, in short form, replaces that of divinity in the form of the unitary sovereign. They describe the seat of central political power as thus unstable, requiring constant political reconstruction through potentially coercive feedback between the seat of power and the public, which provides them legitimation. Far from securing a unidirectional politics, Mouffe and Laclau describe the democratic revolution as providing the political field of play, which affords the privileged emergence of forms such as modern liberal democracy, socialism, and totalitarianism, regardless of the difference in the proclivities or the treatments of each of these forms. But it's basically to say that it produces a field. What is able to emerge are these forms of governance. This conception of paradigmatic shift in the political as an ontological dimension of interrelational antagonism is useful for understanding the described paradigmatic shift by Tikkun. The uneven yet intense emergence of cybernetics as an operative logic, supported by the reproductive efficiency of calculating machines and new media, must be taken as a reorientation of the political field which lacks a critical positioning of its effects, technical, organizational, conceptual, in architecture. Now getting into what makes architecture and architecture theory a good place for this discussion to kind of play itself out. The optimistic argument to be made for architecture as a good place for this political analysis, although mainly because, the optimistic argument to be made is that architecture is a great place for this political analysis to be happening, although mainly because architectural, urban, and infrastructural space is now the active space of derivative political control. Per the, again, radical French language collective, the Invisible Committee, it can be stated in this way: power now resides in the infrastructures of this world. Contemporary power is of an architectural and impersonal and not a representative or personal nature. They argue that we are constantly surrounded by these political operations in the form of high voltage lines, freeways, supermarkets, computer programs, fiber optic cables, etc., very material things. Architectural power becomes the influence with which infrastructures and derivative processes determine the political relations between forms of life and introduce their own inclinations. Infrastructural focus is already in play in the work of Keller Easterling, Kenny Coopers, Brian Larkin, Shannon Mattern, and others who have taken on technologies and infrastructures as assemblages of political and economic forces. But they are more widely taken as sites of effect rather than sites of operation. That still, again, I would argue it's this conceiving of a paradigmatic shift that has happened within the political that makes this kind of new room for examining these sites in a more useful way. In examining sites of material ideology in the form of architectural, urban, and spatial objects and practices, the point is to further indicate these cascading apparatuses of governmentality and to begin to understand the terms of the political field of affordances in which they emerge. Largely, this necessarily needs to take place between designers and their relation to the tools that they use, specifically at sites which confront underlying cybernetic concepts alongside the varieties of spatial software in action. And although this doesn't kind of end in a conclusion, but as an outlook, this kind of begs to be done in a way that fuses the sort of material and ideological softwares that use in architecture and the cybernetic concepts that relate to them, specifically in looking at ecology, system, and environment through the design softwares. We can look at protocol, network, and affordance through the modes of analysis in these more emerging tactics like space syntax, which breaks down, let's say, it's the same thing as looking at a network as a topology, that they break down the city into lines and nodes. And this is largely how we view decisions that are being made in the city at this point, or potentially ways of providing better feedback for architectural space. Then autopoiesis, survival, homeostasis. In the operational softwares that we use, this is the San Francisco building made by Morphosis, and it is the first fully operational responsive architectural system that responds to its environment without any human interaction, and is also the first site where you had a bunch of people basically breaking that system because it meant that they could not open windows. The windows would only open when the building determined that it should be opened. And so this first attempt was also the first failure. And then in an even older example, these sites of participation, communication, and feedback, because something that we do inherit from Douglas Spencer is this being very critical of hyperpositive concepts that are given to us. And in architecture, that is at the very least when things are talked about as ecologies or ecological, and when they're talked about as forms of participation, because usually that means that there's not a kind of critical reflection on these. And in that way, these kind of incorporative softwares that, even though it's not in a completely technical way, but we are since the 60s and 70s, that this idea of incorporating the non-architect as a designer of their own space in this kind of IKEA way has been present, but in ways that it only ever presents an already architectural logic of saying, yes, you can design your own room, but in the way of the tool that we've designed for you. Now, this is done in IKEA, but this is also done by Züblin in the last 6 years as well. That these sites of software, not necessarily always, not always built buildings, I should say, not always capital A architecture, but these sites of material and immaterial software are then the kind of sites that we, in the architectural theory, this is where we can kind of do the work of charting how these shifts are happening. That's a bit of a anticlimactic end.